You are a Persian spy crouching in the rocks above Thermopylae. It is 400 NT BC. You have been sent to assess the terrifying Spartan army that blocks your path. You expect to see iron walls and giants sharpening blades. Instead, you see men sitting in the dirt, naked, carefully combing their long hair and oiling their skin. You run back to King Xerxes and report that the enemy is acting like women at a spa. Xerxes laughs. He thinks they are insane, but standing next to him is an exiled Spartan king who isn't laughing. He turns to the great king and whispers the terrifying truth. The Spartans do not groom themselves for vanity. They only fix their hair when they know they're about to die. What you saw wasn't a leisure activity. It was a funeral rite. Those men aren't planning to survive the week. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The truth is, those 300 men were never supposed to be there. In Sparta, it was the season of the Carneia, a religious festival where warfare was strictly forbidden. To march an army during the Carneia was a crime against the gods, punishable by death or exile. The Spartan government refused to mobilize. They told the rest of Greece to wait for the full moon. But King Leonidas knew the Persians wouldn't wait. He knew if he followed the law, Greece would burn. So he found a loophole. He couldn't take the army, but he could take a personal bodyguard. He dismissed the young elite cadets who usually held this honor. Instead, he handpicked 300 older veterans. He had only one requirement for this mission, a detail that proves this was a suicide run from the start. Every man he chose had to have a living son back in Sparta. Leonidas wasn't building a tactical unit. He was ensuring that when these men died, their family lines wouldn't die with them. When he left his wife, Queen Gorgo, she didn't ask him to come back safe. She asked for his final orders. He didn't say, "I love you." He said, "Marry a good man and have good children." He was already gone. They marched north to the Hot Gates, a narrow pass where the mountains crash into the sea. There, they joined a coalition of about 7,000 other Greeks. It sounds like a lot until you look at what was coming. Xerxes was bringing the largest invasion force in human history up to that point. Modern estimates put it at 200,000 soldiers. This wasn't an army. It was a moving city that drank rivers dry. They had marched all the way from Asia, crossing the ocean on a bridge made of boats. Now they sat camped on the plains of Trachis, turning the horizon into a sea of campfires. Xerxes waited 4 days, convinced the Greeks would run away when they saw his numbers. They didn't move. Frustrated, he sent a messenger to the Spartan line. The messenger didn't offer terms. He just pointed at the massive Persian army and gave a simple command. "Lay down your weapons." Leonidas stood at the front of his 300 fathers. He didn't give a speech. He didn't negotiate. He shouted back 2 words that defined the Spartan spirit. "Mollen Labe." Come and take them. To understand why Leonidas's defiance was so shocking, you have to understand exactly what he was yelling at. We often picture the Persian army in movies as a disorganized mob of slaves driven by whips. That is a complete fabrication. The force staring down the Spartans was the most sophisticated, wealthy, and technologically advanced military machine the world had ever seen. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed Xerxes brought over 2 million men, and that when they stopped for lunch they drank entire rivers dry. While modern historians have debunked the millions claim, the reality is almost as terrifying. Most estimates settle around 200,000 combat troops, plus a massive train of support staff. In 480 BC, that wasn't an army, it was a migrating super city. It was larger than the population of almost every Greek city-state combined. Moving a force this size required logistics that bordered on magic. 4 years. That's how long King Xerxes spent preparing for this invasion. He didn't just march, he reshaped the geography of the earth to fit his needs. When his fleet faced a dangerous peninsula at Mount Athos, a place where a previous Persian fleet had been destroyed by storms, Xerxes didn't risk it again. He ordered his engineers to dig a canal straight through the land. They cut a shipping lane through solid rock and sand for 1.5 miles, just so his navy wouldn't have to sail around a corner. Then there was the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. Xerxes built 2 pontoon bridges, tying nearly 700 warships together with flax and papyrus cables so thick they weighed as much as tree trunks. He paved the decks with wood and soil so the horses wouldn't look down at the water and panic. He literally walked his empire across the ocean. This was the power of Persian logistics. They had supply depots staged all along the Thracian coast, stockpiling millions of pounds of grain years in advance. They were an unstoppable industrial force. But this massive size was also Xerxes' greatest weakness. A force of 200,000 men creates a ticking clock. They consumed food and water at a rate that is hard to comprehend. Hundreds of tons of wheat and thousands of gallons of water every single day. The land couldn't sustain them for long. Xerxes couldn't simply besiege Thermopylae and wait for the Spartans to starve, because his own army would starve first. He had to keep moving. He had to break through. This puts the Battle of Thermopylae in a new light. It wasn't just a clash of swords, it was a clash of time. Leonidas didn't need to kill everyone, he just needed to stop the clock. Every hour the Spartans held the pass was an hour the Persian beast grew hungrier, thirstier, and more desperate. Xerxes knew this. Sitting on his throne, watching the tiny line of Greeks blocking his multinational steamroller, he must have felt a mix of rage and anxiety. He had the numbers, he had the engineering, and he had the God-given right to rule. But he was stuck in a bottleneck. He ordered the assault. He didn't send the elite troops first. He sent the Medes and the Scythians, conscripted soldiers from the fringes of the empire. Many were lightly armoured, carrying wicker shields and short spears. They were brave men, but they were about to be fed into a meat grinder designed specifically to destroy them. The massive Persian Ocean was about to funnel into a space no wider than a country lane. The logistics that got them there no longer mattered. The engineering didn't matter. The money didn't matter. Now it was just geometry. Leonidas did not choose this battlefield by accident. In the ancient world, geography was destiny, and Thermopylae was a masterpiece of defensive selection. In Greek, Thermopylae means the hot gates. The name comes from the natural sulfur springs that bubbled up from the foot of the mountains, filling the air with the smell of rotten eggs and steam. To the superstitious soldiers marching toward it, it must have looked and smelled like the entrance to the underworld. But strategically it was a choke point. In 480 BC, the coastline was different than it is today. Back then, the sediment hadn't yet pushed the sea back. The pass was incredibly narrow, a strip of land sandwiched between the vertical limestone cliffs of Mount Kallidromos on one side and the Malian Gulf on the other. At the middle gate, the point where the Greeks rebuilt the old Phocian wall, the passage was only about 50 feet wide. This 50 feet of dirt is the most important character in this story. It is the reason the battle happened at all. In military theory, this is called a force multiplier. It didn't matter that Xerxes had 200,000 men. It didn't matter that he had cavalry, chariots, and archers. In a space that narrow, a massive army is paralyzed. The Persians could not flank the Greeks. They could not surround them. They could not use their superior numbers to overwhelm the line. They had to come head-on in a column, funneling their vast ocean of soldiers into a tiny stream. This meant that at the point of contact, the odds weren't 200,000 against 7,000. It was 100 Persians against 100 Greeks. And in a fair fight, man to man, Leonidas liked his odds. This brings us to the men standing behind that wall. While the legend focuses on the 300 Spartans, we must give credit where it is due. Leonidas was commanding a coalition. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans were roughly 7,000 other Greeks. There were men from Tegea, Mantinea, Corinth, and Phocis. There were 400 Thebans whose loyalty was questionable, and 700 Thespians, who would prove to be among the bravest warriors in history. Leonidas organized them into a rotating system. The Spartans would take the front, the deadliest position, and then cycle out to let the allies fight, keeping the front line fresh. They locked their shields together, creating a wall of bronze and wood that spanned the entire width of the pass. The Persians watching from the distance saw this wall. They saw the red cloaks of the Spartans, a colour chosen so that blood would not show. They heard the rhythmic chanting of the paeans, battle hymns to Apollo. Xerxes gave the signal. The first wave of Medes and Scythians surged forward. They ran with a shout, a chaotic, terrifying roar meant to intimidate the enemy. But the Greeks didn't make a sound. They didn't charge. They just stood there, knees bent, shields interlocked, spears levelled. The Persians slammed into the Greek line with the force of a car crash. The sound was deafening. The crack of wood, the scream of metal on metal, and the sickening crunch of bodies being crushed by the momentum of the crowd behind them. But the line didn't break. The geography held. The hot gates had closed. The collision at the hot gates was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was industrial slaughter. To understand why the Persians were being butchered so efficiently, we have to look at the engineering of the two armies. This was a conflict between two completely different military philosophies, speed and mobility versus weight and discipline. The Persians were designed for the open plains of Asia. They were light, fast, and relied on archers to soften up the enemy before closing in. Their armour was made of quilted linen or fish-scale iron sewn onto leather. Their shields were made of wicker, woven branches that could stop an arrow but were useless against a heavy strike. Their spears were short and their swords were daggers. They were built to chase down fleeing enemies, not to crack open a metal shell. The Greeks, and specifically the Spartans, were built for one thing: the collision. They were hoplites, named after the hoplon, a massive, concave shield made of wood and covered in a thin layer of bronze. It weighed nearly 20 pounds. When a Spartan stood in formation, his shield covered his own left side and the right side of the man next to him. This interlocking design meant that the phalanx was only as strong as the bond between the men. If one man ran, the wall broke. But Spartans did not run. As the Medes crashed into this wall, they discovered the terrifying geometry of the phalanx. The Spartans were fighting with the dory, a spear 7 to 9 feet long. The Persian weapons were significantly shorter. The result was mathematical. The Persians were dying before they could even get within striking distance of the Greeks. Imagine being in that front line of the Persian attack. You are pushing forward, driven by the weight of thousands of men behind you, but you can't reach the enemy. All you see is a wall of bronze shields with no gaps, and out of that wall, row upon row of spear points are stabbing with the rhythmic precision of a sewing machine. You grab a spear shaft to break it, and the Spartan simply switches to the secondary weapon on the other end of the spear, the saurator, or lizard killer, a bronze spike used to finish off the wounded on the ground. The Spartans weren't just killing, they were managing the corpse pile. The efficiency was cold and robotic. As the Persian bodies stacked up, they became an obstacle. The Greeks would step forward, pushing the dead and the dying with their shields, literally paving the ground with their enemies to maintain their footing. This was the othismos, the great shove. It wasn't the cinematic, individual duels we see in movies. It was a rugby scrum of death. The back rows of the phalanx pushed into the front rows, driving the bronze wall forward like a bulldozer. The pressure was so intense that men in the front lines could be crushed to death without ever being struck by a weapon. The breath was squeezed out of lungs. Ribs were snapped by the weight of the collective mass. For the Persians, it was a nightmare. Their wicker shields shattered under the impact of the heavy Greek spears. Their swords couldn't penetrate the solid bronze breastplates of the Spartans. They were fighting ghosts, faceless warriors hidden behind metal helms who never spoke, never screamed, and never stopped stabbing. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes, watching from his golden throne on a nearby hill, jumped to his feet 3 times in terror. He wasn't scared for his own life. He was scared because his worldview was collapsing. He was the king of kings. His army was invincible, and yet he was watching his soldiers being threshed like wheat. By the afternoon, the first wave was broken. The Medes and Scythians retreated, leaving thousands of dead in the narrow pass. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the iron smell of gore and the sulphur of the hot springs. The Spartans cleaned their blades, they drank water, they rotated their lines. They hadn't even unleashed their full brutality yet. They knew the first wave was just a warm-up. They knew Xerxes would not take this insult lightly. They looked up the pass and saw the dust rising again. The king was done sending the amateurs. He was sending the immortals. As the sun began to dip on that first bloody day, a strange hush fell over the Persian lines. The broken remnants of the Medes were dragged away, and the battlefield was cleared of the worst of the debris. From the Persian camp, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the chaotic shouting of the conscripts. It was the rhythmic, disciplined marching of 10,000 men moving as one organism. Xerxes was playing his ace. He sent in the immortals. These were not just soldiers. They were the terrifying elite of the empire. They were called immortals not because they couldn't die, but because their unit strength was never allowed to drop below 10,000. If a man fell, another instantly stepped up from the reserve to take his place. To the enemy, it seemed as if they were fighting a hydra that could regenerate its heads instantly. They marched in silence, their faces covered by cloth cowls that hid everything but their eyes. They wore gold jewellery under their robes, a sign of their high status, and they carried the finest weapons the empire could produce. They were the emperor's personal shadows, the men who had conquered the known world. Xerxes sat back on his throne, confident that this would be the end of it. The Spartans were tired, covered in gore, and dehydration was setting in. The immortals would simply walk over them. But as the elites closed in on the hot gates, they ran into the same physics problem that had destroyed the conscripts. The immortals were masters of open-field maneuverability. They were trained to dance around an enemy, to use flexibility and speed, but inside the pass there was no room to dance. The Spartans saw them coming and realized these men were dangerous. The immortals were heavier than the Medes, better armored with iron scales beneath their colorful tunics, but they still carried shorter spears and wicker shields. The technological gap remained. When the two elite forces collided, the result was a grinding stalemate. The immortals threw themselves at the bronze wall with suicidal bravery. They grabbed the Spartan spears with their bare hands, trying to snap the wood. They tried to crawl under the shields to hamstring the Greeks. But the phalanx was a machine designed to reject foreign objects. The Spartans stabbed, pushed, and stepped forward, their heavy shields smashing into the faces of the Persian elite. Then the Spartans did something that looked like a disaster. They broke. Suddenly the Greek line shattered. The Spartans turned their backs and began to run in a panicked, disorganized mob toward the rear of the pass. The immortals, seeing their invincible enemy finally routing, let out a roar of triumph. They broke their own disciplined formation and charged forward to cut down the fleeing Greeks, abandoning their ranks in the thrill of the chase. It was a trap. This was a maneuver that required nerves of steel and absolute trust in your commander. Running away with your back exposed is the most dangerous thing a soldier can do. But at a silent signal, the fleeing Spartans planted their feet, spun around 180 degrees in unison, and lowered their spears. The immortals, now a disorganized crowd running at full speed, ran straight into a fresh wall of spear points. The slaughter was catastrophic. The momentum of the Persian charge was turned against them. Caught off balance, out of formation, and unable to stop, they were impaled by the dozens. The Spartans butchered them with mechanical efficiency. This happened not once, but multiple times. The Spartans played with the immortals, using their own aggression against them. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They proved that discipline, not numbers, wins battles. By evening, the immortals were retreating. The psychological impact on the Persian army was devastating. These were the gods of war, the untouchables, and they had been beaten by a group of tired old men. That night, the mood in the Persian camp was funereal. Xerxes was no longer jumping from his throne. He was paralyzed by indecision. He had thrown his sheer mass at the Greeks, and it failed. He had thrown his best elites at the Greeks, and they failed. He was running out of options for impossible victory, cleaning their wounds and eating their meagre rations. A tragedy was unfolding in the darkness above them. The Greeks had won the battle of tactics, but they were about to lose the battle of information. A local man named Ephialtes was making his way to the Persian camp. He wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a general, he was a shepherd, and he carried a secret that was worth more than 100,000 soldiers. He knew a way around the wall. History often turns on the smallest of hinges. For 2 days, the entire might of the Persian Empire had been held back by a few thousand men and a clever choice of geography. Xerxes was humiliated. His officers were terrified of his wrath. The invasion of Europe was stalling before it had truly begun. But in the shadows of the Persian camp, a man arrived who would change the fate of the Western world. His name was Ephialtes. In pop culture, Ephialtes is often depicted as a deformed monster, a hunchback rejected by Spartan society. This is a dramatic invention. The historical reality is far more mundane and, in a way, far more disturbing. Ephialtes was a local Greek, a Trachinian shepherd. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who wanted money. He looked at the slaughter at the hot gates, looked at the desperation of the great king, and saw a business opportunity. He approached Xerxes' generals and told them what they had been praying for. There was a back door. High in the mountains above Thermopylae, there was an old goat track known as the Anapaya Path. It wound through the forests of Mount Calidromus and dropped down behind the Spartan wall. It was steep, difficult, and hidden by thick oak forests, but it was passable. For a bag of gold, Ephialtes offered to guide the Persians through the darkness. Xerxes didn't hesitate. Under the cover of night, he detached the immortals, the same men who'd been humiliated hours earlier, and sent them up the mountain. Imagine the tension of that climb. Thousands of Persian soldiers moving in the pitch black, guided by a traitor. The path was covered in dry oak leaves. Herodotus gives us a chilling auditory detail. The air was so still that the sound of thousands of feet crunching on the dry leaves sounded like a roaring wind moving through the trees. Up on the mountain, Leonidas had stationed 1,000 Phocian hoplites to guard this exact route. He had anticipated the flank. These men were supposed to be the cork in the bottle. If they held the path, the Spartans below were safe. But as the Phocians heard the crunching of leaves and saw the torches of the immortals emerging from the woods, they made a catastrophic mistake. The Phocian commander saw the massive Persian column and assumed the immortals were coming to attack them. Panicked, the Phocians retreated from the narrow path to the top of a nearby hill, forming a defensive circle to make their last stand. They prepared to die fighting for their homeland, but the Persians didn't care about them. The Persian commander Hydarnes saw the path open up. He ordered his archers to fire a few volleys to keep the Phocians pinned down, and then simply marched his army past them. He ignored the Phocians completely. It was a tactical blunder of epic proportions. By retreating to a better defensive position, the Phocians had inadvertently opened the door to Greece. They stood on their hill, weapons ready, watching in horror as the immortals streamed past them, disappearing down the trail toward the sea, toward the rear of the Spartan line. Down below in the pre-dawn light, the camp runners rushed to Leonidas's tent. The news was grim. The seers had examined the entrails of the sacrifice and predicted death. Lookouts ran in breathless. The Persians are behind us. The pincer had closed. The geography that had been their greatest weapon had just been turned against them. The hot gates were no longer a shield, they were a tomb. Dawn. Day 3. The air was cold, but the news was colder. Scouts came stumbling into the Greek camp breathless and pale. The immortals were descending the mountain. The trap had snapped shut. Leonidas called a final council of war. He looked at the faces of his allies, men from Corinth, Arcadia, and Mycenae. They had fought bravely, but now staying meant certain death. Leonidas did something that proves he was a strategist, not just a warrior. He didn't demand they die with him. He ordered them to leave. He knew that Greece would need every sword for the battles to come. There was no point in throwing away 7,000 lives when 3,000 would serve the same purpose. He told them to retreat south, to regroup, to protect their cities. But Leonidas himself could not leave. Spartan law was explicit. Retreat was not an option. A Spartan king did not run. Moreover, there was a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi given months earlier. Either your glorious city will be sacked by the Persians, or the Lacedaemonians will mourn the death of a king. Leonidas chose to be the sacrifice that saved his city. However, the history books and the movies often stop there. They tell us that 300 Spartans stood alone. This is the greatest injustice of the Thermopylae legend. When the dust of the retreating allies settled, Leonidas looked around and saw that he was not alone. 700 men from the city of Thespiae, led by their general Demophilus, refused to obey the order to retreat. We must pause to appreciate the Thespians. The Spartans were bred for war. They were fulfilling a lifetime of indoctrination. The Thespians were not. They were citizens, farmers, and craftsmen. They had no law forcing them to stay. They had no prophecy. Their city was not safe behind the Spartan peninsula. It lay directly in the path of the Persian army. By staying, they were essentially guaranteeing that their hometown would be burned to the ground. Yet, they stayed. They chose to stand and die beside the Spartans simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. There were also 400 Thebans, though history is divided on whether they stayed as volunteers or as hostages to ensure Thebes' loyalty. And we must not forget the Helots, the Spartan servants and light infantry, who likely stood and died in the hundreds, unrecorded by history. So, it wasn't 300 against the world, it was roughly 1,500 men facing a tsunami. As the sun rose, the realization settled over the camp. There would be no rotations today, no relief, no sleep. Leonidas gathered his men. He didn't offer them hope. He didn't promise a miracle. He offered them clarity. According to legend, he turned to his comrades and delivered one of the most badass lines in military history. He didn't tell them to pray, he told them to eat. Eat a good breakfast, men, for tonight we dine in Hades. It was a grim joke, a dark acceptance of their reality. They weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the body count. The goal had shifted from holding the past to inflicting maximum trauma on the enemy psyche. They wanted to make the Persians pay such a high price for these last few yards of dirt that they would never forget the name of Sparta. The shields were tightened. The last drops of water were shared. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and the 400 Thebans turned to face the Persian Ocean one last time. On the third day, the sun rose on a different kind of army. The Spartans and Thespians knew they were surrounded. The tactical game was over. There was no longer a need to hold the line or preserve energy. There was only one objective left, to take as many Persians with them as possible before the end. Leonidas ordered the men to leave the safety of the narrow Phocian wall. They marched out into the wider part of the pass, a suicidal move that allowed them to engage more enemies at once. They didn't wait for the Persians to attack. They charged. This wasn't a phalanx anymore, it was a brawl. The Greeks crashed into the Persian lines with the fury of men who have already accepted their own deaths. They drove the Persians back, toppling them into the sea, trampling them into the mud. Herodotus tells us that the Persian commanders had to stand behind their own troops with whips, lashing them to force them forward against the Greek demons. In this initial furious charge, the inevitable happened. Leonidas, king of Sparta, was struck down. In Hollywood, the hero usually dies last alone after a dramatic monologue. History is not so kind. Leonidas likely died early in the final skirmish, pierced by Persian arrows or spears. But his death sparked the most intense moment of the entire battle. In ancient Greek warfare, the body of a king was sacred. To lose it to the enemy was a disgrace worse than defeat. A furious struggle erupted over his corpse. It was a scene straight out of the Iliad. The Spartans, seeing their king fall, surged forward. They didn't fight for ground. They fought for his body. 4 times the Persians tried to drag him away, and 4 times the Greeks drove them back, hacking through piles of enemy dead to retrieve their fallen leader. Against all odds, they succeeded. They dragged Leonidas back to their lines, a final act of loyalty to the man who had led them to hell. But the weapons were failing. The heavy spears Dory had shattered long ago. The men drew